Look at her hands shaking, Your Honor. My father pounded the table hard enough to rattle the water glasses. That woman is a drug addict. She has no business controlling my mother's estate. His voice filled the entire probate courtroom in Boston, while I sat perfectly straight in a charcoal suit, staring at the polished wood table in front of me like it belonged to someone else's life. For years, my family had treated me like a mistake they'd rather forget. That morning, they genuinely believed they were finally burying me for good. My sister Claire dabbed her eyes with a bone-dry tissue, leaning into her husband, who wore a watch that looked expensive from across the room and cheap up close. For weeks, they'd been feeding everyone the same story, that I'd stolen prescription pills and manipulated our grandmother into rewriting her will. Their lawyer slid a thick envelope toward the court clerk. Glossy medical records lit up the monitors. A 30-day rehab stay, severe dependency, psychiatric instability. My own attorney glanced over at me, pale with panic. I didn't blink. Because that treatment center was a shell company, and the billing format on those exact papers matched a laundering network I'd spent 6 years quietly tracing for the federal government. The judge read through the documents in complete silence, while my sister performed grief for the gallery behind me. Then she stopped on page 4, tapped one signature block with her finger, and looked over her glasses at my father. "Mr. Ellison," she said, her voice like a blade, "are you certain you actually know what your daughter does for a living?" He laughed, too loud, too confident, and told the entire courtroom I was a clerical nobody who couldn't even hold down an apartment. That was his mistake. I stood up, walked to the center of the room, and told them the truth. 12 years earlier, when I was 22, he had thrown me out of the house after finding a prescription bottle from an ER visit, a visit for exhaustion and a panic attack. He'd called it addiction, spread that story through the entire family, burned my discharge paperwork in front of everyone who would watch. The courtroom went completely still. I kept going. I told the judge that my father hadn't just destroyed my reputation, he'd emptied my college fund, too. While I was sleeping in libraries and bus stations after he cut me off, my grandmother had quietly hired a private investigator of her own. She found everything. My father was drowning in debt, and he'd drained my custodial account to help pay for my sister's wedding and keep her husband's failing business afloat. I held up bank statements and wire transfer receipts, payments to a country club, a bridal salon in Manhattan, a high-end caterer. My sister shouted that I was lying, but her husband's face went completely white because he knew exactly what a paper trail looked like. I wasn't finished yet. In those lonely years after I was thrown out, my grandmother had quietly pulled me back from the edge. She paid for my certification exams, my master's degree, my forensic accounting training. By the time she passed away, I was a senior investigator with federal clearance and a habit of following money until it told the truth. While my sister's angry video online was busy calling me unstable, I opened my government laptop and got to work. The forged treatment center records had an employer identification number attached. I ran it. The shell company behind it belonged to my brother-in-law. It was the exact entity he'd been using to launder investor money through his collapsing hedge fund. He had handed me the smoking gun himself. My father and brother-in-law hadn't filed that injunction to protect my grandmother's legacy. They filed it because she had left me 80% of her estate and named me executor, locking both of them out completely. They needed to discredit me before the hearing, so my brother-in-law manufactured fake rehab invoices, and my father delivered them to the court in tears. The judge saw through the fraud almost immediately. The moment she asked the clerk to verify the filings, federal investigators walked into the hallway outside, because I'd already called them myself. The look on my brother-in-law's face when the courtroom found out I was a forensic auditor with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network was almost worth every hungry night I'd survived. My father finally understood that the daughter he'd called broken had actually been the one quietly tracking his downfall the entire time. My sister started crying for real when federal marshals asked her husband to hand over his phone. The judge revoked the injunction on the spot, referred the forged documents to federal prosecutors, and froze every account tied to my brother-in-law's company. Before I stepped down from the stand, I read my grandmother's final letter to me out loud. It said only this: "Let them think you are nothing. That is when a wolf survives." I walked out of that courthouse completely alone, but I wasn't defeated, not even close. For the first time, I owned the story, the truth, and the money that came with it. Outside, the wind off the harbor cut straight through my coat, but for the first time in years, I actually felt warm. I hadn't won by shouting or begging to be believed. I won by waiting, by learning everything I could, by simply refusing to disappear. My family spent years trying to turn me into a ghost. Instead, I became the evidence.